Now I want to move into this is a bit of a leading question to the other one for you guys. And Alex, I'll start with you on this one again. And John, if you can just jump in immediately after with any additional information. What is a subpoena?
Yeah. So a subpoena is basically just, a legal document ordering or requesting a party to produce documents, other materials, other items, or to appear in court, appear for a deposition, any sort of court setting, whether it be actually in a courthouse or in a law office. But basically, it's just a court-ordered command to abide by whatever this party's asking of you. So my experience with subpoenas is either to get someone to show up to a deposition that was dodging my communications, or to get some documents that a party's not wanting to disclose, or you find out there's other policies and whatnot out there. So most of the time I use it is to get documents from a party, which is usually what the most common form of a subpoena would be. And there's two types of subpoenas. I know one subpoena is ducus tecum. And the other one is like telecommunicated. I don't know, something. I've only ever heard people use ducus tecum, but that's basically, like I said, to get documents, other tangible items that you want to inspect for whatever the case is. The other one is to force someone to show up in court, or to a setting, some sort of court setting. And that is basically the rundown of subpoenas.
And the implication is that if you do not comply with the subpoena, then there are penalties for that. The most recent example in the news today was Steve Bannon failed to comply with the subpoena to appear before the United States Congress, and he was convicted of contempt of court, and is now facing, I believe, up to 60 days minimum mandatory for violating that subpoena.
So what you're saying is you have two elements here. One is you show up in court, or else meet the consequences of the legal stick, right?
Yeah.
Or you have refused to give us documents that we need for our case, and again, if you do not comply with that, you then also face the legal consequences of the stick, so to speak, which is, whether it be time in prison or fine, or, some other piece. But presumably there is some form of a record of you not complying with the subpoena as well, which will obviously reflect negatively towards you as a citizen, correct?
Sure. And then if you are the recipient of the subpoena, you can go to court and file a motion to quash the subpoena, to negate the subpoena.
Mm-hmm.
And then the judge will get involved and decide whether or not the subpoena was reasonable to begin with.
Yeah.
Great.
Otherwise, you got like 30 days to, respond or produce whatever, and
right.
If you're fighting it, then you better do it.
Right. So I think that's a great lead-in for the difference between the court in terms of the actual legal system and the NFL's legal system that they have in order to assess circumstances, bring in evidence, and make decisions. So the next question, again, I'll start with you, John, is what is your take on the fact that the NFL would obviously have an inability to issue subpoenas to whether it be witnesses or any other person within the general community to force evidence, if you will, as compared to the courts, which what we're, kind of what we've alluded to at the early part here of our recordings, which is, I want this evidence to prove this or prove that, you must comply or else. So how do you think the ability for the NFL to not issue a subpoena may impact the quality of their investigation? And do you think we as fans really ought to be taking that into consideration more often? And I find that we're not.
Well, it absolutely limits an organization's ability to investigate something internal. That doesn't mean that that they can't get a quality investigation if witnesses are cooperative. There's nothing that says you as a potential witness have to show up only because of a subpoena. If you want to talk to the NFL investigating body, you certainly can. When I was a paramedic before I was a lawyer, and there were certainly situations where I was asked to testify in a trial and would be violating patient confidentiality. And I like, I'm happy to talk to you, but you're going to have to subpoena me in order for me to violate that confidentiality. So that absolutely happened on multiple occasions. But if I were a cooperative witness, if any of these accusers were cooperative, the NFL can certainly ask them any questions they want, and they can give whatever answers they want. Outside the scope of a subpoena, however, and outside of a setting of giving sworn testimony, then there is not a risk of a penalty for perjury. They can say whatever they want, but they're not going to be subject to penalties of perjury if they're not being sworn in. And it's kind of hard to do that in the setting of an NFL investigation.
Right. Alex, do you have anything else that kind of might add to that at all?
Yeah, I mean, just like John was saying, it's just kind of, they still, I know people have kind of been talking about the subpoena power or lack thereof in terms of how the NFL investigated it. I mean, I read countless things talking about, well, they only talked to 12 out of the 24, and they only presented four pieces of testimony. But, kind of with the subpoena thing, the 12 could be all that decided to actually cooperate. And
right.
So that could be the entirety of their investigation from what they were able to get from people who were willing to talk. And I saw something too that said it was more from the most of the plaintiffs' attorneys. I think it's all the same. I don't think there's any other one, but how the first kind of crop of people that were interviewed or in the investigation kind of didn't feel that NFL was doing, I don't know if adequate's the right word, but an appropriate job of how they were handling their claims. And so perhaps, they were all willing to cooperate at one point. And then after that, the attorney said, nope, you guys got 12, have at it. I don't care. Because at the end of the day, he's just wants money for his clients. So he doesn't care what the NFL really does with them.
It's kind of like the Browns when they said that they did a full investigation of their own before they agreed to trade for Watson. They didn't talk to a single one of the women. That's kind of hard to see how you do it. A really thorough investigation.
Yeah. I think the Browns investigation was asking the league, what's the worst case scenario on a suspension? And they said, a year. Okay, do it. I think that was the investigation. But then they used an ambiguous way to kind of try to wrap it all under one umbrella, and maybe it just fly over the media. But
and we'll sign Rosen to a 1-year deal just in case.
Yeah, right. But yeah, and I kind of talking about the subpoena power and sort of issuing some discipline. I thought it was interesting. There's a couple articles talked about other examples of their investigation, and so it was talked about like Zeke Elliott 5 or 6 years ago.
Yep.
Even though he was never charged, never arrested, anything like that, he still got 6 games. Because the ex-girlfriend, the one that brought the claims, was fully willing to cooperate. So, it's and here you have kind of a similar, I guess, situation from the criminal aspect, at least up to this point, someone who didn't face any sort of criminal liability, but still was handed half a season or close to half a season because, it's sort of a different burden, if you will, with the NFL's investigation. And that witness was fully cooperative. Whereas here, this is such a complex, issue with 25, 30, who knows how many actual claims out there. It's one in an infinite number shot that all of them would actively want to participate and cooperate in this investigation.
And let's remember, there's still 4 or 5 active cases out there. And Alex, I'm sure you can imagine what a 404B hearing would look like in these cases. 404B is a rule of evidence that talks about whether or not evidence from other occurrences could be allowed into another trial. So let's say that plaintiff A, who is still seeking damages against Mr. Watson, that lawsuit goes forward to trial. Theoretically, all the other 29 or 59, however many other accusers are out there, theoretically could testify in the trial for plaintiff A. And you can imagine what a circus that could end up being.
Yeah.
So on that note, I think there's an interesting kind of sub question beneath those comments, and that is the Texans recently settled with not 24 women, but 30 women.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that raises some questions naturally for anyone who has passed grade school math. And that is the fact that, 30 is greater than 24. And then you start wondering, just a little bit, and then you start wondering where the additional 6 came from and why we haven't heard from that additional 6. So I think there's a fair, natural segue for, the inquisitive mind to simply say, okay, 1, where did the other 6 come from? 2, did the other 6 settle out of court?
That's probably
which is you'd almost think probable. And then 4, John, again to your point, is could those additional 6 in those types of scenarios just be brought onto the stand to testify to solidify basically a pattern of behavior?
I think part of it probably depends on the nature of the settlement and whether or not there was a non-disclosure agreement as a condition of that settlement. Those women may not be allowed to testify, but none of us know exactly what the terms of the settlements were. But any of the active cases that are still going on could potentially testify in any of the other active cases. And if another witness shows up that a grand jury finds to be more credible, there still could be criminal charges filed, and we just don't know.
Right, but the criminal charges again would be for someone new stepping forward, because as I understand it, anyone that had existing claims, unless I've misread anything, has already gone through the grand jury process thus far. Correct? That's what I've read, at least. Now I might be mistaken, but that's what I've read.
I believe that's true, but you never know if there's a new accuser to come forward. And I am by no means suggesting or labeling Mr. Watson as a serial sexual predator, but to the extent that a generic sexual predator is out there, the numbers suggest that those who are untreated, that never seek treatment to resolve that issue, the recidivism rate is incredibly high. And I would not be surprised to see more people come forward.
No, I think that's pretty fair within the context we're talking about here, and something that I think is an important thing to look at as well. So with regards to Watson's punishment, since we've kind of gone through both the civil, we've gone through some of the other elements. With regards to Watson and his case, where do you think the NFL's punishment is going to land, given the information that we all have before us now?
So, you thinking like in terms of games or in the appeals, or what do you?
I'm thinking the initial punishment. We'll start with that, because I don't want us to get ahead of ourselves and start skipping steps in the process.
Yeah.
So, what do you think the initial punishment is going to be?
So I think that the Judge Robinson, the one that's doing the review and is going to issue the opinion, and just from what I've read with kind of remarks of Watson planning to, appeal in federal court if he gets a year, and that the NFL doesn't really want to go through their, formal appeal process after whatever discipline is implicated or handed out. I think that she's going to find kind of a healthy middle ground to sort of give the NFL kind of their justice, but also give Deshaun, not indefinite suspension like the NFL is wanting. So I think 8 to 10 games is probably where she's going to land in. Maybe 6 to 8, but I don't see it being any less than that.
I agree. I think 6 is the absolute floor. I did a little background check on Judge Robinson, and let's be clear, Judge Robinson is not assessing this from the bench. She is a retired judge who now does civil arbitration, and she has been hired by the NFL to be an arbiter in this investigation. So it's not a judge's ruling from the bench, and I think that's an important distinction. So, I just did a little research. There are studies that say that 47% of the NFL fan base are women, and that's certainly gone up a lot. So the NFL's got a problem if there is anything that is considered a slap on the wrist. And given the way that the Browns have structured Deshaun Watson's contract, a 6-game suspension is maybe $400,000. That's chicken feed to this guy. So I think it's got to be something approaching double-digit games for the NFL to not have a perception problem. If they're going to suspend someone for betting on another team, suspend him for a year, this has to be something that would be perceived to be more serious. So I certainly hope it's at least 8 to 10 games, if not more.
So I think that's really interesting. So I guess what the question would be, and this is where it gets really, we'll call it murky. And I think I'm trying to choose my words very carefully because I think that's appropriate. So I think what the problem that NFL fans are going to have with what I believe the decision's likely going to come down personally, and I'm curious from just like the legal background piece, what you guys think of this, is I think that they're going to view someone betting on another team from an NFL perspective as impacting the integrity of the game.
Yeah.
And we can probably collectively agree that while the integrity of the game is exceptionally important, that from a fan perspective, I think fans are going to look at this type of behavior as more serious. But I think what fans are going to struggle with is that from an NFL perspective, I actually think that they're going to perceive the integrity of the game as being more serious to their business compared to the personal just behavior, if you will, of one of the players on a team. And I think that may be where a lot of fans struggle. And I'm just curious if you think that Alex's kind of general range may be more likely than not in terms of where the NFL lands, just because of that as a general statement. The NFL is going to look at integrity of the game as being, from their business model, at the far end of the 911 5-alarm fire kind of sliding scale. And, to many, or dare I say 47+% of the fans' perspective, they're going to look at the personal conduct of a single quarterback as being below that. What are your thoughts on something like that? Just from we're looking at this from a purely analytical and legal perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sorry.
No, please go ahead.
I think you kind of hit it right on the head there with, it's the heftier suspension, I guess, at least right now, because it hurt the lining of their pockets, and in more of a grand scheme of like, well, if he's betting on games, who's else is betting, and who's out there shaving points? Who's going to be who's Paul Crew out there? And, I think that is kind of the optics of it more, is like more grand scheme, more so the league as a whole. Whereas then the Deshaun Watson, the optics is like, yeah, this guy was, pushing up to be the face of the league and one of the highly touted players in it, but he could just be a bad apple in the mix, more so than like questioning the entire integrity of the whole entity, But at the same time, this is a different, as obviously because of what's going on, this is just a totally different and more sensitive matter than one player who was already taking time off, putting in a DraftKings bet or whatever he did, than compared to this. But I think it's important to note that prior to going through this process, the NFL wanted to suspend Deshaun Watson indefinitely, and they were just unable to, reach an agreement on that. But I think that kind of goes to show you the seriousness of at least the NFL took with what was going on and what they initially wanted to do in terms of discipline. When you compare that to Ridley getting a year for betting.
But again, Ridley was betting on himself to win.
Yeah.
So I mean, there wasn't even a suggestion that there were, now he was injured at the time.
He took like mental health. I don't think he was injured, but I suppose today mental health is an injury. That's not completely correct of me.
So, I mean, I have to believe that there are dozens of NFL players who are wagering on games via their second cousin once removed, or their next door neighbor. So,
or their brother.
Right. So I just don't think that. Certainly they're sending a message to players via the Ridley suspension, but man, you have to think that 47% of the NFL fan base being women in today's climate, that they have to send a message. They didn't really do it with Big Ben. They haven't done it with domestic violence cases, and they felt the blowback from that. I have to believe that this is a case they're going to make an example